Here continues our look at ancient Greek art, a story of naturalism and idealism. Lecture 7 covers classical art, which begins about 450 or 440 BC and ends with the 5th century, in 400 BC. If classical art had a defining moment, this is it. As with the first and second Persian invasions that closed the Archaic and opened the early classical period, there is a specific historical event that offers a convenient date for the change in style, the peace with Persia that was signed in 449 BC. Before talking about the significance of this, let's review some essential points about the historical context leading up to this point. We will remember that even after the important Greek victories in 480 and 479 BC, the Greeks still felt vulnerable to another Persian invasion. Perhaps with a touch of hubris, they also envisioned taking their own vengeance on the imperial superpower. For this reason, in 477 BC, Athens coordinated the formation of an alliance of Greek states known as the Delian League. Member states, pictured here in yellow, except Attica, which is pictured in red, contributed soldiers, ships, supplies, or money. But some found the cost too exacting, and when they attempted to secede, Athens used military force to compel them to remain in the league and contribute their resources. In this context, Pericles came to power. Remember, Athens was a democracy, and there wasn't even an official president or prime minister, so Pericles was styled first citizen in a rule from 461 to 429 BC. In 454, he made the decision to move the League's treasury from the sacred island of Delos to Athens, allegedly to keep it safe from the Persians. The Leaguers were still actively involved in conflicts with Persia, although the theater of war had shifted to Egypt, which was also seeking liberation from the Persians and called on the Athenians to help. Although the Greeks came, the rebellion was unsuccessful. Other conflicts continued until the Greeks and Persians officially signed a peace treaty in 449 or 448 BC. This had a direct bearing on Greek art, since this peace prompted the building program on the Acropolis, which ushered in a new style. In fact, these monuments comprise the most important expression of high classical art, but they also came at a price. Athens arguably misappropriated the League's funds, and in doing so, traded conflict with Persia for conflict at home. In some ways, the Persian invasion marked a high point for unity in Greece, which was characterized in this period by close interfighting and constantly shifting military alliances and territorial borders. But the most catastrophic inter-Greek fighting was probably a direct outgrowth of Athens' own new imperial ambitions. You may be wondering what was going on with Sparta, and certainly some of the Delian League's rebels appeared to Sparta for help in their attempts at secession. Sparta itself did not join the League for a variety of reasons, including perhaps what might be called a lack of interest in the affairs of the Greeks across the Aegean Sea and Ionia. The Spartans were also initially preoccupied with the largest Helot rebellion, or serf-class rebellion, in their history, but they quickly came to view Athens' imperial expansion as a threat, and Sparta became the leader of a new Peloponnesian League. This map shows the pseudo-Athenian Empire in red and Spartan allies in purple. Neutral states are in green. Inevitably, what was known as the Peloponnesian War broke out, lasting from 431 to 404 BC. Sparta was initially victorious, but peace was short-lived, and the conflicts would resume in the 4th century. Today's lecture will deal mostly with the high classical art executed before the Peloponnesian War on the Parthenon in particular, but it will also cover later works on the Acropolis. With the outbreak of the war and the death of Pericles in 429 BC during a plague that added to the tumult of these times, specialists see another shift in the classical style by the last quarter of the 5th century. However, I won't dwell on that distinction. Before we discuss the art, I just want to add that, even if you don't realize it, the 5th century and also the 4th century are probably the ones you're thinking of when you refer to ancient Greece. And this isn't just because the Parthenon dates to this time. Classical culture of the 5th century includes the great literary masterpieces by the tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, as well as the comedian Aristophanes. whose play Lysistrata, which I've mentioned, dates to the late 5th century. The most famous of all great plays, Sophocles' Oedipus the King, most likely premiered the year Pericles died, in 429 BC. The philosopher Socrates would have been alive in this period, as his 70-year life was put to an end in 399 BC. But now we can turn to the art. The classical moment in art coincides roughly with the historical Periclean age about 461 to 429 BC, and more particularly with the flowering of Athens during the Periclean building program begun in 448 BC. Accordingly, you might think of the classical moment as the Parthenon moment. The rigidity of the severe style has ceded to a more relaxed, more sensual, and more lifelike approach to figurative art, which has more of a timeless stillness than a rigidity, and an even more pronounced idealism. As we'll see with the Doryphoros, pictured at right, the Contrapposto pose has been fully developed by moving the relaxed leg backwards instead of forwards, as in the Critios boy or the Riace bronzes, although you might note that artists continued to use both relaxed back leg and relaxed front leg poses for the remainder of antiquity. All in all, this gives figures their most natural and lifelike standing posture yet. Idealism is rendered more concrete, as it is mathematically theorized in a canon of proportions. Any individuality of the figures cedes to a kind of Platonic ideal, a composite of perfect parts. Facial expressions betray no emotion, and the figures have a restrained feeling throughout. Instead, they are characterized by an immutable dignity that Winckelmann famously described as noble simplicity and calm grandeur. Even so, pathos and tension or struggle are conveyed, mostly through narrative and composition, as we've seen before. Finally, keywords that describe the classical aesthetic, the goal of which is a kind of perfect beauty, include harmony, balance, and controlled rhythm. Before we get to the Parthenon as both a building and a gold mine of classical architectural sculpture, I want to continue our discussion of the freestanding nude figure and hopefully tie that to these classical principles. The embodiment of classical ideals may be found in Polycleitos' statue, the Doryphoros, dating to about 440 BC. Doryphoros means spear-bearer. The modern Greek word for spear is still Dory. Essentially, it is a depiction of a beardless, strong-muscled athlete, or a way to show a young man in his physical prime. The statue is slightly over life-size, as was common with the Koroi we looked at, and was originally rendered in bronze, which was the material in which Polykleitos worked. It is only known through Roman marble copies, with the best known and most intact version coming from the excavations at Pompeii. It goes without saying that this is a highly idealized rendering of a human figure, but it also embodies the quintessence of classical naturalism in the high classical Contrapposto. That's to say, not only are the body parts plausible as in the early classical period, but the Contrapposto pose has been slightly modified so that the resting leg falls gently backward rather than projecting forward, with the result that standing figures have their most natural, lifelike, and relaxed posture yet. Perhaps more importantly, it's the most aesthetically pleasing, as the backward leg better provides a springboard into the most graceful array of S-curves centered on the axis of the body. While you could trace many visual paths, they all have an incredible sense of balance, harmony, and controlled rhythm. You should know that this effect was very carefully contrived by the artist. In fact, we know that Polykleitos designed a sculptural work that demonstrated the principles outlined in his written treatise entitled The Canon. Although this literary work no longer exists, a 2nd century CE Greek author named Galen referred to it, and from these references scholars have determined that the Doryphoros is most likely the statue meant to demonstrate Polykleitos' canon. Of course, canon, in the artistic sense, refers to a code for proportions, and ancient Egyptians had established canons for their rather repetitive throughout the centuries depictions of figures. But we'll see in a moment how Polykleitos' canon may have been contrived to establish a unique set of internal ratios that would, once again, maximize that sense of overall harmony through a kind of subconscious observation of repetition and balance. Before we see how, we should note that physical beauty was important to the Greeks. We've seen this in the way corporeal perfection was showcased in Greek art almost from its inception. We've also talked about how the choroi, in particular, were ideal images not of the populace per se, but of the aristocratic patrons who could afford to commission the statues. In fact, the ideal aristocratic gentleman was someone both of good character and good looks. There was an expression for this particular combination. Kalos kagathos. Kagathos means good in the sense of virtuous or upstanding. Kalos, as we might remember from our vase inscriptions, means beautiful, although it can connote more than just a handsome face. It can also refer to a kind of manly poise, a charming comportment, someone who takes care of himself physically. In its combined form as kalos kagathos, it just means a great man, a true gentleman. So if you're troubled by the fact that these rather impersonal, expressionless classical statues with their idealized cookie-cutter faces lack a sense of character, rest assured that they are great men, and women too, for an ethos of excellence is implicit in their good looks. The Greeks of this time were preoccupied with the idea of arete, or excellence, and for males, the physical training we talked about is just one part of the overall training in excellence that more broadly applied to their accomplishments and character. Of course, adding narrative elements, even small ones like a spear, which suggests excellence in athletics or warfare, imparts a better sense of character than their faces. There are a few other key traits of classical art in general that I haven't mentioned yet. Simplicity and seemliness go hand in hand, but simplicity means that there's just enough to get the point across. Complexity can get messy, and classical art hates messiness. Keep things simple, straightforward, clear. Likewise, seemliness means that all elements are suitable for the purpose, and more importantly, in good taste. Classical art should not make you uncomfortable by virtue of something being indecorous, overwrought, or unbefitting. Pathos is subtle, and really, classical art should elevate you. Formally, you can follow these rules and have trivial subjects as well as heroic ones, but given what I said about decorum or seemliness, squalid subjects are not really part of the repertoire. Usually the work is intended to elevate the viewer morally or spiritually. Purity of line makes more sense for 2D work, as it refers to the crisp, clear contours that lack sketchiness, but more importantly show a command of the skill of drawing or rendering the subject, typically in concise but graceful ways. While there are no lines in sculpture, your eye does perceive edges, and it follows visual paths. These should be smooth, clear, crisp, and pure. Inherent in Polykleitos' canon was the ancient Greek idea of Sinat Rhea. This word literally means measured together, and rather than referring to what we call symmetry, it referred to the proportions of the human body, that's to say, parts to one another and parts to the whole. This comparison of parts forms a ratio. Some have surmised that Polykleitos' lost canon was based on what we today call the golden ratio. This ratio is 1 unit of measure to 1.618 units of measure. When you map the Fibonacci sequence of numbers onto a grid, a golden spiral fits in it. This is a pattern that occurs in nature with the arrangement of some leaves and arguably other objects. By extracting 2 units from the Fibonacci sequence, you can see that the ratio of 1 unit to the next largest unit creates a golden ratio, 1 to 1.68. But is this ratio in the Doryphoros? By one calculation, it is. The unit from foot to navel has a 1 to 1.618 ratio to the unit from foot to head, that's to say the whole body. But how does this ratio compare to others? Let's look at what the human body would look like if we deviated from the approximate 1 to 1.62 ratio with regard to the navel's placement on the body. You can see how the proportions start to get wonky. But just one use of the ratio could be accidental. To see if Polykleitos has applied it elsewhere, let's break down the red line into 2 parts measuring 1 and the remaining 0.62. Sure enough, there's another break into separate units, at the knee. We should also note that according to the Fibonacci sequence, the length of the new blue line automatically equals the length of the shorter piece of the purple line when divided at a 1 to 1.62 ratio. But then I wondered what would happen if I brought the green line up above the blue line, or rather, divided our second blue line into a golden ratio. Sure enough, the chin marked the division of the remaining space there. It's tempting to continue dividing the Fibonacci sequence and look for more golden ratios, but this is only one possibility for determining Polycleitos' canon. Departing from the mathematically abstract, we should return to our discussion of naturalism and idealism. To determine how naturalistic a representation is, we should probably compare it to an actual image from nature. By putting the statue beside a photograph, even with a slightly exaggerated, slightly leaning contrapposto, we can determine whether the basic proportions and the representation of anatomy is accurate. It was actually during the classical period that writers began explicitly referring to the realism of the representations, using the word aletheia, or truth. Only during the Hellenistic period was a theory of idealism developed. However, as noted during our lecture on archaic art, we can give our own meanings to these words. For our purposes, I propose that naturalism and idealism coexist, rather than displace each other in some way. To elaborate a bit further on how the two concepts merge, we'll look at an anecdote about the painter Zeuxis and his painting of Helen of Troy. As is the case with almost all classical panel painting, none of Zeuxis's works have survived, but ancient texts describe them as notable for their realism, small scale, novel subject matter, and independent format. Apparently, his technique created volumetric illusion through manipulating light and shadow, a change from the usual method of filling in shapes with flat color. We've seen the latter method in such late archaic mural paintings as the Tomb of the Divers. We will later look at some Hellenistic work where the lessons of the classical period have resulted in a three-dimensional look based on modeling with light and shadow. Zeuxis contributed to the composite method of composition and may have originated a novel approach to the ideal form of the nude. Keep in mind, however, there is no nudity in female sculpture and only exceptional examples of female nudity in erotic vase painting. We imagine it's the same in easel painting in that Helen's corporeal beauty was conveyed perhaps with the same type of clinging drapery that we're about to see in the Parthenon sculptures. In any case, as the story goes, and as a 19th century artist illustrated here, Zeuxis could not find a woman beautiful enough to pose as Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. So he selected the finest features of 5 different models to create a composite image of ideal beauty. Incidentally, this is essentially the 18th century neoclassical theory of the beau idéal, and you can see how it synthesizes the natural and the ideal. As noted, we could talk about the idealism archaic representation of the human figure just as easily as we could talk about the idealism of the classical period. So the more defining factor that separates the two is the degree of naturalism that they both have. Now, the way all these words can be used connotatively and quite specifically in certain contexts does make it a bit confusing, and you have to remain acutely aware of how you're defining the words. I'm defining idealism as the tendency to represent human figures as a model of physical perfection and absolute beauty. I'm defining naturalism as the tendency to represent the human figure as consistent with the laws of nature. I would use the word realistic in the same way, but I avoid it here because although naturalism can have its own connotations in different periods, realism is often much more highly connotative of showing nature not just in a plausible representation, but one that also has the truth of nature's random accidents, the mistakes that may detract from perfection, dirtiness, wear and tear, physical idiosyncrasies, and so on. I do think idealism to some degree can only be achieved when the principle of naturalism applies, since while we conceptually understand a statue like the New York Choros is meant to represent the ideal of youthful beauty and physical fitness for its time, we find it lacking in perfection when we use nature or reality as a measure. The Choros no longer looks perfectly beautiful when we imagine it waking up and coming to life as a human being. The Doryphoros easily passes that test. We could argue about whether he's too perfect to exist in nature, but there's an inherent subjectivity already in this appraisal. When Zeuxis chose one woman's eyes, another's lips, another's legs, another's breasts, another's hips, who but Zeuxis was really the judge of this? To consider what the words idealism and naturalism mean to you, I'll invite you to contemplate the following array of images where the Contrapposto is still employed for undressed models today. Any thoughts on how to determine which of these models would be the starting point for your canon? Does one sum it up, or do you need to extract various parts from different models? You might also consider the question of how natural they look and how this figures into your estimation of an ideal. Notice how many underwear ads were aestheticized by the use of black and white photography. Is perfection a precise canon, or is it a spectrum? How limited would this spectrum be? Throw another image into the mix. Are both of these men worthy of a Times Square billboard? Men, like women, are challenging body image in the media. But is there a difference between inclusion and admiration? Do aspiration and emulation, or attraction and desire, figure into your estimation? Beauty may remain in the eye of the beholder, but we should be wary of coming to facile conclusions. After all, we live in a time where body acceptance is touted, but we have an unprecedented number of ways to fix things, to perfect ourselves. Shifting the conversation a bit, I think we should remember what this statue embodies. We've been looking at this ubiquitous male nude statuary since the early Archaic period, but the Koroi were classified primarily as grave markers, cult statues, or votive statues. We viewed the transition to more character and narrative-based statuary in the early classical period. However, we don't really know who the Doryphoros is. Even if he embodies the canon, he is also a spear carrier. Is he an athlete? Is he a warrior? Is he Achilles? Where was his original location? Was it in a gym, as the much later Roman marble copy from Herculaneum was found? Is it a commemorative statue like the charioteer of Delphi? Perhaps a winner of the Olympic Games? There may be other implicit themes. As I briefly mentioned when we first encountered nudity on vases, the Greeks actually considered male nudity to be a sign of sophistication and refinement. Contrary to many of our preconceptions, to the Greeks, nudity represented civilization. The barbarians, as they called non-Greek speaking foreigners, were considered less cultivated due to their rejection of nudity as a general principle. However, the Greeks maintained a strong sense of propriety with regard to nudity. Women were covered in public, and they generally did not see men exercising or competing in the nude. Revealing the glans was also considered indecent, and the foreskin was often tied to avoid any accidental exposures. In sculpture and painting, the flaccid penis was generally rendered on the small side, a kind of exaggerated retraction, I think, to remove overtly sexual connotations. Remember, in art, sexuality is often visually equated with the uncivilized or non-rational side of humanity. Even so, we've admitted there's an inherent eroticism to the nude body. We know the unbearded male in particular is still fair game, and how could we forget those writers who spoke of the gymnasium as a place that incited homosexual desire? Object of emulation, of appreciation, of desire, or all of these at once, the Doryphoros creates an ideal template for the male body, a carefully calculated system of proportions that could be applied to all statues. In fact, we see the same body, the same face, the same canon in another statue by Polykleitos, the Diadumenos. This statue depicts a muscled athlete tying a victory ribbon, for which he is named, around his head. As with the Doryphoros, there are many Roman marble copies of this bronze original in various states of preservation. You can actually find 2 of the 25 known copies here in New York at the Met. The statue on the left actually was partially restored by using a plaster cast. Only the head, arms, and parts of the leg are original. The plaster cast torso helps hold it all together. Although the Polykleitos statues are beautiful, you understand better the problem with an ideal, ultimately a formula, when you find yourself looking at more or less the exact same figure with just a different pose to the arms. In female statuary, there are still no nudes, but there is a rapid progression in terms of the portrayal of the underlying anatomical forms during the 5th century. As you can see from this Roman marble copy of a statue of Aphrodite, originally cast in bronze around 420 to 410 BC by Callimachus, the drapery clings so closely to the body so as to almost reveal it. Furthermore, Aphrodite's left breast is exposed, a touch of immodesty appropriate only for the goddess of love. We'll see more of this clinging drapery in the Parthenon architectural sculpture. And with that, we'll turn to the Acropolis.